Osei-Frimpong. I come to you live, and this is a bit of a late show, but I want to get this out because my kids have a very big cross-country race tomorrow, and I want my mind clear when I go and cheer them on, because there's an outside chance that both my 8-year-old and my 10-year-old, or my 7-year-old and my 9-year-old, they run an 8 and 10 division. My 7-year-old and my 9-year-old set state records tomorrow. So that's very exciting for at least one person here, and I want to do this show and be done with it before that happens. And I spent some time actually gathering clips because it's a fascinating episode. I'm going to talk to you about the kind of falling apart of the generic populist movement in the United States as those people in the internet, as those people come to realize that in a post-Bernie world, economic populism isn't really the motivating factor for political behavior the way that we like to think it is. And it's funny because you do any real labor organizing, you start off with the idea that, well, if we tell people that they will get more money if they join a union, they'll definitely join a union. But then you actually do the organizing and you do the work and you realize that it's not the money that brings people in, it's the dignity and say in their workplace and reclamation of their freedom that actually makes people join a union. And there's this notion among the economic reductive left and right that if we offer people money and appeal to their material interests, they will join the movement and forsake anything else, forsake any other sense of identity that they have. And that's just not true. And it's hard to make that case because some people especially white people, had so much invested in the idea that this was true because the white right wanted to pretend that they weren't racist, and the white left wanted to pretend that they didn't have to deal with racism. And so they came together under an economic reductive ideology called generic populism. I think that is realized most clearly in Breaking Point's Krystal and Saagar show. And I can say Krystal and Saagar because we're all friendly. I like them. They're actually good people whom I disagree with, and I think they've are going to learn or have to kind of grapple with the fact that some fundamental presuppositions that undergirded their project were actually faulty, and they've always kind of been manifestly faulty. They just kind of ignore them, but it's going to be harder and harder to ignore as people vote on abortion and some immigration, and not in a way that can be immediately tied to economics, to checkbook issues. They're going to have to admit that actually people care about other things. People care about other things, or the economic identity is a function of other mutually reinforcing institutions, including the church. Their ideas of property ownership, their ideas of family, their ideas of civic engagement, and their ideas of political supremacy that also are of a piece with their economic ideology, and that all fits together. And you had that work on the left on one side and work on the right on the other side, but they're actually different kind of organisms, the Siamese twins that kind of shared an organ, which was economic populism, but they're actually different systems, and it figured into each system in a different way, and people actually cared about their identity, which was the whole body, not like that little component of it. So when Carville said it's the economy stupid, it was never actually the economy stupid. It's like the economy is a condition of all these other aspects that are also conditions in a mutually reinforcing system that makes up our identity. And this is coming to a head now as it's becoming more and more obvious that people don't behave based on economics alone. You can't tell the poor Israelis and poor Palestinians that, well, if they all just kind of come together and realize that religion is dividing them and that they all have the same economic self-interest, that they could heal together, like that's not going to work. But we understand that with Israelis and Palestinians. We understand that with Ukrainians and Russians, but somehow with Americans, especially along the black-white racial divide, we try to pretend, or at least that faction tried to pretend that something else was the case. Now, I'm going to tell you that there is a handful of videos that I'm going to try to play, snippets of give me a second while I load them, of Krystal and Saagar talking about Ta-Nehisi Coates' interview on CBS. If you don't know, Ta-Nehisi Coates was on CBS, and he's been doing the rounds lately talking about how Israel's an apartheid state, because it turns out that Israel's an apartheid state. I've told you before, and I think people will hear it now that Ta-Nehisi Coates, you go there and you say, well, there are two different sets of laws for two different people, and as a foreigner, he has more rights than some people who've lived there for generations, and that's not right, because in a well-ordered state, in a state proper, the citizens of that state should equally rule that state, and that should be the way it is in a nation proper. But Israel is an apartheid state, in the same way that when Gandhi went to South Africa, he people don't know this about Gandhi, but when he went to South Africa, his big push was that as a citizen of the British Empire, he should not be treated like a black person. He should be treated like a citizen of the British Empire. So that's when he came up with all this nonviolence about how he needs to show his humanity to the British so that he will not be treated like they treat the real second-class citizens, the black people. So, Gandhi in Africa has a kind of a different understanding. We have a different understanding of who Gandhi is than the Gandhi in the West that we get. So the idea is that second-class citizenship in all forms is kind of a bad thing. It's one reason why I, at least in the United States, don't really like illegal immigration, because I think it incentivizes second-class citizenship. I think we need real citizens who can then fight as real citizens alongside other real citizens for our collective benefit. They have to commit to the United States if they're going to be part of the state. So Ta-Nehisi Coates goes to Israel, sees apartheid, calls it apartheid, and would you believe people say that, why don't you believe that Israel has a right to exist? Doesn't Israel have a right to exist? And to which Ta-Nehisi Coates says that actually states don't exist by right. He's right and wrong with this. Some states do exist by right, those that are institutions of freedom. There's a difference between an ethno-state and a state. States are institutions of freedom properly. Ethno-states are not institutions of self-governments, because all the selves in the state can't govern the state. But states proper, when they are well organized, are institutions of freedom and do have a legitimate right to exist. Now, they might not come about by that right in the same way that a person who comes about by a crime or some sort of illicit behavior might not have come about by freedom of a married couple making love in a consensual and loving affair. But as existing people, one doesn't have the right to exist more than the other, right? Insofar as they are both good as, bastions of freedom, right? So Israel does not have a right to exist because it is not an institution of freedom. It's an institution of apartheid. Now, if it changed its laws so that random Jews across the world cannot just move there and have more rights than Israeli citizens, then proper Israeli citizens, then it would have a right to exist. So, people say, oh, well, you can't say the same thing about Saudi Arabia. Yeah, I can. Saudi Arabia does not have a right to exist. Any institutions that's not an institution of freedom does not have a right, does not exist by right. It exists by power. And so if there was some huge revolution to topple the monarchy of Saudi, or the gangster UAE crowd, group of families that run UAE, I would not bat an eye if that happened. I think that would be just fine. So you don't have nobody has a right to an ethno-state because ethno-states are not institutions of right. I'll say that again. Nobody has a right to an ethno-state because ethno-states are not institutions of right. Now, you can say that is the United States an institution of right? Possibly. Possibly. There's a way in which we came about through an idea, and insofar as of right, and insofar as we came about through the idea of right, that was actually eloquently articulated in some aspects of the Declaration of Independence and realized in some aspects of the U.S. Constitution, we have a right to exist. But insofar as we're an institution of slavery and an institution of racial degradation, entrenched racial degradation, if some other power wanted to take us, or if there was an internal revolution, which arguably Mr. Lincoln's war was an internal revolution that was anti-constitutional, then that would be right. Like the United States as a white nationalist nation does not have a right to exist. It may exist in such a form, but it doesn't exist so by right. I hope that's clear. Having a little trouble with the clips, so I think I might do a different show on clips because this is going long enough. But Coates goes on CBS, talks about Israel as an ethno-state not having a right to exist, but no ethno-states have a right to exist, and gets suggested that he's an anti-Semite. But Saagar freaks out in ways that really do profit from actually seeing the freak out. I can't describe it with its due freak outness because he just has a problem with Coates because he thinks Coates is a race hustler who's the problem with everything in the United States over the last 10 years with respect to racial discourse, because everything is we are not, black people in the United States cannot be equivalent to the Palestinians. Now, I will tell you that insofar as there's codified racism in the United States, you don't really need it. We're a capitalist country, and black people were locked out of, and not black people, American descendants of slaves especially, were locked out of capital. I live in Georgia right now. Georgia is about 32% black. We own a fraction of the commercial real estate. So if you live in a capitalist economy and you don't have capital, you are food for the people who have capital. And you can say you can just go to school and then in a few generations you'll have capital. But it doesn't really work like that because, it doesn't really work like that for a few reasons. One, we underestimate how effective the Jim Crow regime was in pretty much bleaching black cultural formation and then only allowing the quality of cultural formation that works for the benefit of black subordination. Right? There is not really an autonomous black media voice. There is no real black autonomous institution because when you don't have capital, how can you have autonomous institutions? And you can say other people come here from other countries and they do fine in America. Just blacks need to get their act together and have some agency. Well, you know what? They come here with often degrees, often connections home, but they also come here with an intact culture. They come here with an intact culture and a family, right? The black family is a mess, and we're a little bit ashamed of that because, if you look at my mom, she's kind of light. She's a product of rape, just like all other black people are. Black family has been a mess since we're brought over on boats, which is why the black immigrants who come over on planes do better. Do better because they could have a family culture that was intact and not overdetermined by terrorism. And I can say this because, my Jim Crow mom side of the family grew up scared of white people and scared of white capital and scared of the power And that over determines some of the decisions they make and the moves they make, and like the quality of autonomy they can have. And that's like a deep thing. And we're not honest about what it means to have an entire community that emerged out of sexual violence and what that means for the black family. Like, I did a show on this before, and like nakedly emerged out of sexual violence. Like nakedly emerged out of sexual violence, and how the black family bonds were never allowed to be strong. And insofar as they were strong, they were always undermined. And so even with the Civil Rights Act, when de facto de jure degradation was outlawed, you brought in a liberalism that then inserted the market ideology right into the black family. So then you got no-fault divorce up the wazoo, and already the idea the feminists started to eat because they started telling black women, white women in intact families started telling black women that men are useless because they wanted more leverage over their white husbands. So there was like, people don't understand what it means to be part of a vulnerable community. Like, black people are members of a vulnerable community. And one thing that Coates is actually honest about, in a way that not a lot of people are, is that we're a little bit ashamed. You're not going to find too many people telling you that black families are a mess. And they're a mess because they are the product of like sexual violence that doesn't go back that far, and just timidity, right? So my grandfather on my mom's side came back from World War II and was one of those guys who was treated better when he was abroad as a veteran than he was when he got back, right? And he was just terrorized when he got back, and that means something. So the black family is the best. All of these institutions of autonomy, that have to do with black American descendants of slaves are a wreck. And they're remediable if we are serious about reparations. But if we're not serious about reparations, it will continue to be a wreck because it's in the reproductive system. And like I said, this is Georgia. It's a third black. We own a fraction of the commercial real estate. Now, mind you, Georgia is a third black. If that number went up to 15% black, there would be a war. You need to gird yourself for white violence because there's going to be a backlash. They would want their stuff. They have an idea of property that mutually reinforces the racism. And so until you loosen their idea of property into accord with the needs of historical violence and what lineage violence means, then black people will never actually be free in the state of Georgia because we'll never actually be able to compete with white capital in terms of commercial ventures. Right? And if you can't compete, you just end up working for somebody. So if you're in public housing right now in Georgia, there's a pretty good chance that your grandkids are going to end up being in public housing too. Because it's not like you can afford this house. My house I bought it in 2015. It's more than doubled in value. So unless you're talking about reparations, which means money only makes sense in terms of other money. So reparations is going to mean taking a cut from white money in order to grow black wealth and power, then you're not serious about racial justice. Now, Saagar, he read this book, The Age of Acrimony, which says the post-Reconstruction period, from Reconstruction to about World War I, it turns out that all of the politics was about the humanity of black people. And all of our political movements were about the humanity of black people. And until you actually dealt with that question, none of the other questions made sense. And I will tell you today, until you deal with the degradation of American descendants of slaves, any real progressive movement is going to founder on the shipwrecks of American descendants of slaves. And that's going to be because we're so vulnerable we will be weaponized against any progressive movement. Go ahead and hit the like button. By the way, if you appreciate me talking like this, which I think you should, go ahead and go to www.funkyacademic.com, kick in $5, $15, or $50 so I can get some better equipment and maybe a marketing budget and do a little bit better about educating the people. But any real progressive movement is going to found because of the vulnerability of the black community, that now we can be easily bought because we are vulnerable and don't have the resources. So you'll be able to buy a few Negro whisperers and gatekeepers to keep the other black people quiet. And this is one thing about Coates. Coates found a way in. They let the wrong one in with Coates. And because he's actually has enough integrity to make these kinds of arguments, and he's got the name that they now have to let him in. He's got the name and the gravitas and the imprimatur of an elite so that they can let him in. They don't have to let me in. Nobody has to talk to me, which is one reason why, once again, you should go to www.funkyacademic.com and kick in $5, $15, $50 a month to keep me doing what I'm doing. But Coates is actually making a lot of these arguments because they let him in and they can't have and they don't have a reason to kick him back out. It would be as if Donald Glover from Atlanta and Childish Gambino started talking like I am, and he was starting to do shows. I guess they had this problem with Paul Robeson and Sidney Poitier to a certain extent, and maybe Harry Belafonte too. They can't not let him in, but now that he's in, he is the wrong one. Israel's not apartheid. Look, you have two different laws for two different people. And you have people who live there who don't control the borders. Even the right wing gets that if you're going to be a state, you need to be able to control the borders, except Palestinians don't get to control their own borders. They don't get to control some random Jewish person in the United States moves to Israel. They now, like, they can't say, like, I don't want any more, like, Americans to move to Israel. They can't close their borders. So if you're in a state and you can't control your borders, and other people who are in that state can control the borders, and the borders are based by ethnicity, then like you're like disenfranchised in your own state. Some random American, some random Californian has more rights in your state than you do. You don't control your own borders. But the other people, the Jewish Israelis in your state, do control those borders, which means you're a second-class citizen in your own state. And that's, you know, that's what happens when you're in an apartheid state. Other people control your state, not you. It's not an issue, it's not a state of self-governance. Yeah, when West Germany was occupied, it was an apartheid state. Yeah, you're right. Like, we should end foreign occupations. Like, this isn't complicated. All right, so Saagar hates Coates because he thinks Coates is some big villain because he made the case for reparations and apparently radicalized a lot of people and birthed the DEI movement, which Saagar hates. But the thing is, nobody in the DEI movement actually talked about reparations. So I think there was this weird projection, and Saagar ultimately, I think, is just one of those people who doesn't like white backlash. And he thinks anything that black people do to provoke white backlash can't be justified. And that, honestly, look, I'm not the racial pessimist. I actually think that reparations would solve a lot of problems. The real racial pessimists are people who think that you can't, like, black people will just always be degraded. And at this, without reparations, black people will always be degraded in the United States as a community. We live in a capitalist nation without capital, and in a place where other people have both culture and capital. We have autonomous access to neither, which is why, like, someone from another country with an intact culture can just move to the United States and and run things because they have an intact culture. Black people have never been able to formulate an autonomous intact culture. That's one of the products of being a people that is like birthed from sexual violence. We're not honest about that, but that is one of the, like, the black family has never been autonomous. The black family has never been autonomous. It was always bleached and then reformed for what it has always been bleached and then reformed for, like, by what white people needed in order for them to continue to, you know, rule over us and as we rent our own country. And so the black church is what it is because that's what white people needed. The black property holdings are what they are because that's what that's what white people needed. Black high institutions of higher learning, the HBCUs, are what they are because that's what Mackenzie Bezos wants. And because she's the one who funds them. And you better believe they're not going to say anything that's going to tick off Mackenzie Bezos. Right? So, shalom from Israel. Hello. And your apartheid state that does not have a right to exist. I recognize that you do exist, but not by right. You exist because you run the United States. So yeah, the United States is a colony of Israel, and I get in a lot of trouble when I say that. But if Netanyahu can say what and do whatever he wants and ignore what Biden says, but Biden cannot do anything except support Israel, then who's running who? Autonomy is the ability to say no. Autonomy is the ability to say you're on your own. Autonomy is like, but Biden can't say no to, and Kamala is committed to not saying no to anything Israel wants. So if Netanyahu can say no to the U.S., but the U.S. can't say no to Netanyahu, who's a colony of whom? I think we're a colony of Israel. And that is unfortunate, but that is nevertheless the case. We are not autonomous. Netanyahu tells us to give him weapons, and we give him weapons. And then we tell him to not do one of these things, and he just does what he wants. So he runs us. We're a colony of Israel. That's just kind of how it is. We need to kind of just deal with that. Some people get in their feelings when I talk about that. Black people understand it's just true. But we're used to being an internal colony, so it's not that big of a deal. No, we're not both colonies of the military-industrial complex. Netanyahu does what he wants. Biden doesn't. So one is a colony of the other, and that's just kind of how it is. I'm kind of reading the chats as I go. So Saagar hates Coates because, and I think hates isn't, it's not a hyperbole, hates Coates because he sees Coates as the godfather, progenitor of all of these kind of DEI, Robin DiAngelo, Ibram X. Kendi kind of initiatives, when those people don't actually talk about reparations. Those people don't talk about how we move money and resources and property to, like, the black black institutions. Right. So, like, so Saagar's just mad. He's just mad that anyone's talking about race, because if you talk about race, if you talk about doing justice to black people, then white people will backlash, and he doesn't like that. He's scared of white backlash, and he thinks that anything that provokes white backlash is bad. And I'm saying that actually some things that provoke white backlash, including white property damage, might be called for. Because your idea of the sanctity of property rights in the United States is part of white supremacy. Now, I believe in property too. I also believe in capitalism. I believe in all of these things. But I think they need to be decoupled from racism. And right now they're bound in racism. And until you actually deal with the racism, you'll never have a properly pure and deserving understanding of the way property allocation should work in the United States. All right, like, so if we destroy property in order, we're going to have to destroy a lot of things in order to get rid of racism. We can, because we're going to pass the laws correctly, and then white people are going to backlash, and then we're going to have to take some of their lives and some of their stuff. And like I said, if black people are 30% of Georgia, and we're going to be made whole in Georgia, we need to own more than like 1 or 2% of the commercial property in Georgia. We need to get up to like 15, 20, 30% of the commercial property in Georgia, which means white people are going to have to take a haircut. We're going to have to take some of their stuff, and we need to come out with schemes taking some of their stuff. So we need to talk about inheritance taxes from Ted Turner to like random Negroes. And some people are going to think that that's an affront to their understanding of family. And they're going to think of that. So, like, and so their understanding of family's got to change. Their understanding of property's got to change. Some people are going to think that that's an affront to their understanding of religion. So their understanding of religion is going to have to change. Like, a lot of white life is going to have to change if black people are going to be made whole. Now, I am the optimist who says, like, that can happen. The pessimists are the ones who said, like, we're not going to be able to piss off that many white people. Those are the real pessimists. Those are the real pessimists. And the pessimists are also the people who say, like, well, you know, it's just not going to work out for black people in the United States. And if we give them reparations, things will just go right back to the way they were. And those are the pessimists, because those are the low-key eugenists. And that's like, honestly, that's about 40% of the whites. 40% of the whites are just low-key eugenists who think that black people are defective insofar as that's the reason we're so broke as a community. And we just don't have, we're genetically defective, and that's the reason we're broke. And if we were allowed resources and appropriate, like, autonomy, we would somehow screw it up, and everything would be worse. That's 40% of the whites, which is why they can countenance, like, doing good racial justice work as a matter of charity, because they don't actually think it's going to work. They low-key think that just like weak eyes are handed down from generation to generation in my household, weak brains are handed down too. So that's pretty much like, you got to deal with the unrepaired eugenics movement in the United States that still does a lot of work because it's simple, it's elegant, it justifies it justifies the current distribution of both wealth and power and prestige. My audio is glitching. That might be my I've been having an audio problem. If you want me to have great equipment all the time, go to www.funkyacademics.com, kick in $5, $15, $50. I do want to say, if you take anything from this, I'll be back with clips, and I'll just do clips and talk about clips at another time. Go and look at the breaking points. I'll put it in the description. Go and look at the breaking points. Go and look at the breaking points interview response to the Coates interview, and the interplay between Coates and Saagar, and Saagar's beef with Coates, and the idea that you can't tie the black situation to the Palestinian situation. And you absolutely can, even if one is de jure apartheid in Israel, and in the United States it's de facto apartheid, because it's in the reproductive system. Like, the property holdings and the institutions are already baked with anti-black animus at the community level. And you can't compete in a capitalist system if your family has been destroyed over generations and generations and generations and generations, and your culture's been destroyed and remade, bleached. Like, African Americans are more American than they are African, and their American culture was made what it was in order to benefit not necessarily black liberation, right? And yet we still end up teaching Americans about America and in a way that, like, you're welcome. We're helping you become, we're invested in this country because we are American, and even though we don't run it, we still have to help you figure out how awful you are as people, as moral individuals. Like, black people keep doing that for America. You can thank King, you can thank a lot of other people for helping you make America what it was supposed to be. And yeah, the system will just reproduce. If you're in public housing, if you're degraded now, like, if you come from people who, like, you know, barely graduated high school, like, and that's the entire community, and nobody has commercial real estate, and people barely own their house, and that's the entire community, there is no way out of that through time. That's not going to heal itself. That's like expecting cancer to heal itself through random mutation. That's not going to happen. You need actually chemo. And reparations would be the equivalent of chemo. And, you know, some people are going to get their feelings hurt about that. Once again, if you appreciate what I'm doing, go to www.funkyacademics.com. I'm going to have another show on this next week. I'm going to have another show on this next week. And I'm going to actually just play clips from Saagar and Coates and Krystal and kind of hash out what happened in a way. All right. Thank you for your time. Peace.